Okay, I'll just try to do this differently. Hold on. Uh, Anyhow, it's great to have heard the preceding panels, and now we're moving on to our closing panel. And I thought it was terrific that we kind of went from the epidemiology to the vaccines, with sort of from observation to experimental science to then what happens when the rubber really hits the road, which is that none of that is meaningful without the interface with humans. Um, so our next panel is terrific for this. We have some very experienced people, and I'm going to ask each of them in turn, and I'll introduce them as I do, to say, you've heard all this. What are two or three things, particularly things we haven't dealt with, particularly in the realm of vaccines, but things you think might also be essential for having vaccines be available and used? That haven't been mentioned already. And I'm going to go around and start in alphabetical order. So we'll start with Rick Bright, who currently runs his consulting company, Bright Global Health, but previously was head of BARDA, which, as everybody knows, funds the government's efforts in pandemic and bioterrorism preparedness and product development. And Rick certainly was very experienced with some of the turbulence that can occur from pandemics and during transitions from his work in BARDA. So, and during the COVID outbreak. So Rick, your two or three big comments, and then we'll take the next person.
Thanks, Jesse. What a great discussion today. A lot about H5N1 vaccines and the outbreak and how it's unfolding. Very insightful and very experienced. I do want to say, though, as former BARDA director, former chair of the flu risk management meeting for the U.S. government, these are not new thoughts. So one of my biggest concerns are these are the similar things, if not same things, we have been discussing since some of them 1997 with the emergence of H5N1, many of them intensely from 2005 and 6 onward when President Bush and started a program to invest in pandemic preparedness. Certainly, they've intensified post 2009 H1N1 pandemic that did not start as well as we needed it to with our pandemic response for vaccines, and of course going through COVID. So there are many lessons that have been captured in after action reports. I don't think many of them have been learned. And I think the comments today that we hear are reiterating the importance of so many of these things, but yet they haven't been implemented, regardless of the $8 or $9 billion that have been made available to invest in these through the time. One of the key comments today was speed. Everyone mentioned speed. Speed is critical. The vaccines, drugs, and tests are not effective if they're not available in enough supply when and where they're needed. And Dr. Webby highlighted that this is not your grandmother's H5. So I don't know how he's aging us. He's been working on this for 30 years. But, leaning into Dr. Kaslow, we're in the 21st century. We should be using 21st century technologies. So why are we still only talking about a vaccine technology that's 80 years old? Why are we not finding every regulatory pathway, every technology, every investment necessary to do what we know will be required for a 21st century pandemic of avian flu? And that is to respond rapidly at large scale globally and not worry too much about fixing a potency assay for an egg-based vaccine that we know in 2009 didn't become available until after the second wave of the influenza pandemic. So we need to take those conversations into how could we use a modern vaccine that may not be linked to a seasonal flu vaccine, that might have a new technology or platform that can respond quickly at large scale and globally. In 25 years after the 2009 pandemic, we know without a doubt that these older technologies and potency assays and delivery administration systems will not be adequate in 2025. So we have to accelerate this work. We have to focus on prioritizing the investments and the technology and the public-private partnerships to accelerating the need for a pathway for using non-traditional modern technologies for the 21st century pandemic response. I'll stop there because Otherwise, I'll go into the need for antivirals that we are really shy and short on. We'll come back to antivirals. We'll come back to testing. There's so much more to talk about, but let's double click on the need for speed. Let's double click on modernizing our response capabilities and our global connectivity so we can make sure that we can meet the demands of a 21st century pandemic when it occurs.
Thank you, Rick. Those are great comments. I'll move next to Dr. Julie Gerberding. And, of course, everybody knows Julie was as an infectious disease specialist like myself, former CDC director, then has also got valuable experience in industry and currently head of the foundation for the NIH. So, Julie, you lived through the anthrax outbreak and worked together with many of us to build infrastructure, like Rick said, that hopefully we'd be better responding with. What's your advice for what we need to be doing now?
Thank you, Jesse. And I just want to verify that you can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, this has been a very robust conversation, and thanks for letting us listen to all of these experts, really kind of round out the picture. I was trying to think about what I could add, and there are a couple of dimensions that we shouldn't lose sight of. One is that among our participants on the panels today, I'm not recognizing anyone who really has a robust engagement currently in the private sector. And yet, I think we all recognize the public-private partnership models that are going to be necessary to accomplish all of the objectives that people are talking about here, in particular, the speed imperative, the clinical trial network development, coordination, and hopefully maturation that we learned the hard way during active was just not up to speed to conduct rapid fire assessments of interventions and treatments. And then I think the point that Rick just made about antivirals, I'm all for vaccines, don't get me wrong, but antivirals are a lot easier to make, and we could certainly anticipate the families of viruses that are going to be most relevant, including influenza viruses. So having a small molecule solution at the ready, to me, just seems like a lost opportunity. But the big umbrella over all of this, and probably the most important lesson I learned in the various situations that were managed at CDC during my tenure, really is the importance of exercising. We can have plans, we can have lots of things on paper, but until you really sit down and not just have a one-off couple-hour thing where everybody is shocked and awed by the break the glass ceiling scenario, but real nuts and bolts, crawl, walk, run, full-scale functional exercises at the community level. We did this during pandemic preparedness with support from Robert Wood Johnson and the CDC Foundation, where Secretary Leavitt and the cabinet of leaders in the state governments met with the leaders of HHS and many other private and public sector leaders at a state level in almost every state to really do tabletop exercise on an influenza pandemic. But in many states, including my own state of South Dakota, that got cascaded down to the community level. So for example, my mother lives in Brookings, South Dakota, and Brookings had a pandemic influenza preparedness exercise that involved various sectors of the community coming together. And until you really get that real, it's really hard for people to understand who would be doing what are the roles and responsibilities that have to be coordinated, and how does all of this come together. I think the other side of that really speaks to the communication issue, because it gives you a chance to really immerse the most influential people in the community in the process of understanding the threat and participating in what has to be true in order for a community to successfully move through it. So I would just make a plea for, while we're thinking about where to invest and what the priorities are, that we don't overlook this really important forcing function for learning, for engaging the public and the communities at risk, and ultimately for moving the needle on the dial.
Thank you. Very important observations. And next, I'll turn to Larry Gostin, who runs the O'Neill Institute and a WHO global National Health Law Center, and has really been a leader in healthcare law and ethics. And so for a very different perspective, we'd really welcome your suggestions, Larry.
Thanks very much, Jesse, and it's really a great conversation. And I agree with everything that Rick and Julie said. And in fact, one of the aspects I'm going to talk about, I've been in partnership with Julie and the NIH Foundation on the pandemic treaty. I suppose since I'm at the law center at Georgetown and working with WHO on the legal side, maybe I'll just cover a few different areas. One, I think they've all been said, but I think maybe I can say them in a slightly more legalistic way. One is on equity and leaving nobody behind. I think, as Rick said, having vaccines when we need them and everywhere, I think is the goal. The second is to look at public trust in vaccines and other medical technologies. I know we're going to come to that later, but I thought I would mention that particularly since the president-elect nominated RFK Jr. As Secretary for HHS. And then look at global governance and regulatory capacities. So, I mean, I think one of the animating features of the COVID-19 pandemic and with Mpox and many other public health emergencies was the idea of the inequitable distribution of vaccines. These things can happen both in the United States and domestically, but also globally. And so kind of thinking consciously about the ways to enhance equitable distribution in real time of vaccines and getting away from the idea of charity, just waiting to give the vaccines away via donations, I think has to change. And I think that's really been the mindset in Geneva. The idea of public trust in vaccines is important because a lot of our discussion is on manufacturing vaccines in enough quantities and even distributing them widely and equitably. But as we all know, vaccines require a whole vaccine infrastructure. You don't just need the product. You need, the delivery systems, the healthcare workers, and you need the public's trust in the vaccine and wanting to get the vaccine and making it accessible. I'll spend most of the rest of my time on global governance and regulatory capacities because they fit in with the first two. I mentioned the project that Julie's foundation and the O'Neill Institute have had on the pandemic treaty, but we've recently concluded the international health regulations at the very final day on June 1st of 2024 when it thought it would collapse. And it was actually Secretary Becerra that walked in the room at the point of collapse and said, the USG is walking away if we don't adopt this now. And it kind of shows the power and influence of the United States when we engage in a constructive, positive way. And I'm not sure whether that will be true or as true in the next 4 years. But there are a number of ideas that have been put forward in the pandemic instrument that I think we have to at least take account of. I recognize they're far more complex and difficult to accomplish than a lot of people would like, a lot of advocates think, and I can go into that if we have time to dig down more. But the idea is for a robust PAB system, pathogen access and benefit sharing system. We've got the PIP framework with novel influenza vaccines at present, but I think the idea of expanding it through a much more robust PIP framework with 20% set-asides and monetary contributions is one of the issues that's going on in Geneva. Another, which I think is far more difficult, is IP flexibilities and TRIPS flexibilities and what the WHO's role can be in that vis-a-vis the World Trade Organization, and probably the most complex and difficult. And this goes to Julie's, I think, very important statement about the importance of public-private partnerships. Is the idea of technology transfer, and how that could happen. Would it happen, and what are the incentives? How can we align incentives to make that happen? All of this is to say that I think that the ultimate goal of the international community here is to develop more stable and diversified supply through regional manufacturing capacities. We already know that the Serum Institute in India has been a big player, but it can do more, and many others in Brazil, South Africa, and others. And we could also just talk about the WHO's mRNA hub series hub network, the first one beginning in Cape Town. And then finally, I've spent a lot of time as a member of and also chair of National Academy of Sciences committees on the global role of the FDA. But I'm going to widen this out a bit and to suggest that we really also need to focus on regulatory pathways that are rapid and rigorous, and also expanding regulatory capacities and shared reliance on each other's data collection and evaluation. I think these are critically important. I mean, the United States, just to give you one example, the United States has been trying to deliver Mpox vaccines to the DRC for many years. The DRC had never given regulatory approval, despite the fact that the European Medicines Agency and the FDA had for many years. The WHO hadn't given it a pre-qualification or other not of authentication, and so we were never able to do that. By the time we had regulatory approval in the DRC, and Biden announced the donation of millions of doses at the UN General Assembly in September, those doses are still in America. They haven't been shipped, at least at the last time I talked to the White House. And so there are a lot of bottlenecks here, and there are a lot of things we can do to strengthen the whole infrastructure for the regulation, manufacturing, delivery of needed vaccines.
Thank you, Larry. Good number of interesting and important areas that we haven't yet touched on. And then also with your major comments, next is Dr. Nikki Lurie, who of course was Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response from 2008 to 16, dealt with numerous outbreaks in the 2009 pandemic, and is currently Executive Director for Preparedness and Response at CEPI. Nikki, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Jesse. And thanks again for organizing this panel. This has been incredibly interesting and informative. And I think it gives us a lot of information about the way forward. I think Larry just touched on a number of the points I wanted to make, so I will make some additional ones. But I think first and foremost is the US isn't an island. We live in a global ecosystem, as I think we all know. And yet sometimes when we have these conversations, because we're here, we focus really on the US response. And so I want to talk first a little bit about some of those interdependencies here. First of all, and I'll start with one of Larry's points, we've talked a lot about equity, and we all appreciate the need for equity, and we appreciate the need for globally distributed manufacturing. Let's remember what happened in COVID is that almost all of the vaccine was developed I mean, was made in the global north. All of the rich countries of the world had contracts in place to get access to vaccine very quickly. It took a long time for there to be contracts for vaccine for low and middle income countries, and ultimately through COVAX that was accomplished. But I will point out right now that we are seeing the same dynamic again, where high income countries have placed orders for vaccines from the manufacturers. And there is no entity that has the responsibility for placing those orders in advance on behalf of low and middle income countries. We are hopeful that the PIP framework will help with that in some ways, but that doesn't come into effect until a public health emergency is declared. And by the time a public health emergency is declared, it's kind of too late to place all your orders and make all your contracts. So I know there are some nuances there, but I want to point out that the global governance piece of this is really terribly important. A second piece where the global governance is really important is in all the stuff that has to do with supply chains. Because the supply chains for vaccine manufacturing and development and manufacturing, as well as other things, are very much global. Supply chains have traditionally been a really, really big bottleneck. I think they are going to continue to be a bottleneck, either because a lot of the stuff exists in the US and the US will block its export, or because other countries will block its export. And I think we can expect the next time around with this, there's so much residual anger for what happened in COVID that there will likely be some kinds of retaliation as a result of that. So want to point that out. And then the third thing to point out in this sort of international dimension, I think Larry and Alessandra before were really good at talking about, and Marco really good at talking about aspects of the global regulatory environment. But also to point out there are going to be lots of competing vaccines out there, and vaccines made from all over the world. They're all going to have different indications. They're all going to have different regulatory frameworks. We're not going to have any system right now of knowing which ones are better and which ones aren't. And I think that there's going to be sort of a lot of regulatory confusion out there unless we continue to work on the global governance aspects of regulatory discussion and sharing. And I know that efforts are underway, but I think that there's a huge piece of work to do there. And then finally, to pick up on some stuff that David Kaslow raised in the beginning, and then Marco and others, with all of these vaccines out there and the fact that in an emergency, you're likely going to have to authorize vaccine on the basis of prior platform information and immunogenicity data. We need systems that are readily in place to get, I guess, what we would characterize as real world evidence, to get effectiveness signals and to get safety signals early on. In COVID, we rely very much on the UK, on Israel, and Qatar to do that. Our systems for doing this in the United States need a ton of strengthening. And in low and middle income countries, there are almost no systems that can do this. So I think all of those areas are areas that I just want to point out, knitting together some of these comments that need some work and attention. The problems are really solvable, however. And maybe to Julie's last point, or one of her points about exercises that I think are so important, because our focus in CEPI is really on equitable access and focusing on low and middle income countries. We've actually begun with some help from Rick and some others doing a series of exercises with low and middle income country manufacturers to even look at their readiness to manufacture right now with whatever technologies they have. And I think to your point about exercises, the more we are able to exercise every single part of the system and do it both here in the US, but also across the globe, I think it's going to set us up in a better place. That also includes, by the way, the global governance systems at WHO and Gavi and UNICEF and others, which have not performed well in MPOX and need some retuning. So I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Nikki. That's also great perspective and helpful. And I want to also acknowledge that several of you have pointed out the importance of industry, and we've had a couple of comments in the chat box about that, and that we did want to include more of that in this meeting. And I think as we go forward or have additional things, and also that in the solutions to all these problems, even where government may need to lead or incentivize, the engagement of industry is critically important, whether it's manufacturing or development or trust, and communication, which shouldn't be willy-nilly. So thank you for that. Along those lines, we do have a few more minutes, and I'd like to ask each of you, you've functioned, several of you at least, in this very public space of outbreak and communication and trust. And we heard great discussions from Bruce's panel and several people on it about that issue. The trust goes much further than vaccines. It's about government, it's about, public health. What would you do now, or is there anything we can do now to begin improving that? And especially as we face, major transitions in government. And why don't I again start with Rick? Rick, you may be muted.
Sorry about that, Jesse. I think I'm on now. No, I think this is a really big issue. I'm going to tie my comments back to 2009 H1N1 pandemic, where one of the biggest issues, I think, and it was emphasized in every after action report from the 2009 pandemic, is the government, the lack of transparency and the lack of clarity on the timelines and expectations on when how bad an outbreak was and when the vaccines would be delivered. And so there was a tendency for the government to overpromise and underdeliver. And I think that had significant impact in the erosion of the trust, not only in government, but also in the vaccine when it did become available. So I think it's important and incumbent upon us to recognize that, trust must be built before that crisis, not during one. And for H5N1 right now, we have an opportunity to demonstrate transparency and scientific integrity right now. And that means being clear about what we know, what we don't know, its potential impact, the severity, and the risk. I think we have a tendency to still downplay what is happening with H5N1 across our country and the world. I think we have a tendency to minimize the potential risk. And in doing so, I don't think it's just the messaging to the government, but it's also messaging to our industry partners and our messaging to even our civil servant employees, our civil service, on what the priorities are and what they should be doing now to be better prepared for something that could be as disastrous as an influenza pandemic. So being clear, engaging the communities early in preparedness efforts is also important. I do not think I've seen for this current outbreak an effective outreach and clear communication to those at the highest risk, meaning where people on the farms in multiple languages from trusted messengers. We still see many reports from farmers in high-risk situations who are seemingly unaware of the risk that they're put in to do their job each day. And so I think we need to engage more effectively early in those harder to reach communities, which means in additional languages with trusted messengers that are not the traditional avenues of individuals maybe going to a CDC website or even seeing a flyer in the grocery store. We have to think about the diversity in our population and our high-risk people workforce and how we communicate. And we have to, most importantly, I think, deliver on our promises. If we say we're going to have countermeasures available and a number of them available at a certain time, we better ensure that they are there and they're accessible when they're needed. If we do have doubts about those timelines, we should be communicating those up front and not setting expectations we cannot meet.
Thanks, Rick. Julie.
I could just echo what Rick said, and thank you. I did a little mini assessment of the federal communication on the most recent COVID pandemic, and in both administrations, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration. So if you really read the transcripts from the White House communication, I had the impression that no one had ever read the CDC risk communication handbook or participated in any of the curriculum, because one of the most important things that was consistently missing was the tendency to first acknowledge that it was really hard and people were really confused and life was very, very difficult, particularly in the early days of the pandemic. Most often the people we wanted to get our health information from, because we did trust them, started out almost verbatim with the statement, "Let me start with the data." I understand why that is, and I understand how scripted the White House press conferences probably are, but in a crisis, most people are not really interested in data. They're really interested in understanding what is going to happen to me and my family. Do these people have a clue? Are they caring about my situation and my experience? And if you don't get past that, the empathy framework, it's really hard for people to listen to all the charts and the data and the statistics and the do's and the don'ts and the rules and the regulations and the mandates. So I do think that where we're sitting right now is a great time for someone or people, and maybe in this case, the closer to the local community, the better, but really at all levels, to be able to have a clean and clear conversation about what's going on, to acknowledge the uncertainty and the challenge and the difficulty, as well as the fear that many people have. And if we thought we were dealing with the stigma of some of the dairy workers before this election, I am positive we will be dealing with a great deal more worry and concern and fear of coming forward for treatment or testing, with the additional imminent threat of deportation. So we're really in a very sociologically challenging situation, and we need to acknowledge that, and at the community level, identify the safe havens and the trusted communicators. I have a kind of a theory that when the feds fail, the states prevail. And I think there are some states where I've seen evidence of really stepping up and doing the kinds of things that we're talking about and improving surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. But in many states, the tendency is to put this on the back burner because it's not a huge problem at the moment, and there are bigger things to think about in the minds of the people who are making those prioritization decisions. So what do you do when we don't have people in the traditional locations who can deliver trustworthy information and guidance? I have to find other sources. And one of the things I was just sitting here thinking about, have we really activated our universities, particularly our schools of public health, but just broadly our academic institutions, where often there are trusted communicators, people who can assemble information reliably and translate it for people to understand. So they're not really government, but they have, the expertise and the knowledge, and certainly many of them have the capacity to be translating. And then, of course, the physician community, because at the end of the day, often it is the clinician or the family physician who is the most trusted. Are we really providing a sufficient layer of granular information and regular updates to them? I'm on the health alert system, and I'm not getting a lot of updated information about this situation, mainly because in my state, it's not the major health issue of the moment. But I do think we need to be activating the rhythm and the networks where we can use all hands on deck to get empathetic, reliable, and accurate information. And to Rick's point about overpromising, it happened in every administration. When they're new in office and something happens, inevitably they overpromise. They overpromise that the severity isn't as bad as they thought, and they overpromise on the delivery timelines for whatever interventions or countermeasures may be coming forth. That's a hard problem to solve because politicians like to do that, but I think that's going to be one of the places where anybody in this audience who's a counselor or an advisor to someone in a position of authority to just really try to hit home on that point.
Yeah.
Don't overpromise. That is the destroyer of credibility, and it lasts a long time.
Great point. Larry, an observation on trust from your point of view.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because on the, over and you can overpromise and also underpromise. I was thinking of Margaret Chan during the H1N1 pandemic about, how she, whipped up a lot of controversy, and it hurt her a lot at WHO when it turned out that it wasn't as bad as anyway, it's a tough issue. Let me just build on the wonderful remarks that Rick and Julie have said. I think I'll just very briefly mention three things. What it means to be trustworthy, how do you do trusted communications, as Julie said, and then I'll finish with a little bit about the freedom of expression, the First Amendment, and social media. The O'Neill Institute is about to launch with the journal Nature, a commission on quality health information, and so I've been very much steeped in this, but I'm also aware about how difficult and complex it is. In terms of, I think agencies need to be trustworthy, that public health communicators need to be trustworthy in the sense that, during COVID-19, I think a lot of them were tarred with the idea that they weren't telling the truth and the full truth. I don't think that was quite true, but what public health communicators need to do, I think, to be trustworthy and transparent is to basically tell very clearly and honestly the public what we know, what we don't know yet, and what we're doing to try to find out what we don't know, just in a very, very clear way. And that, by really focusing on what we know and the evolving nature of knowledge, I think is a better way to convey than we're the experts and we're certain when we're actually not, because the science is evolving. I think trusted communications don't go top down, they really go bottom up. That is, we need to pay a lot of attention to community-based communications and genuine listening to constituencies and genuine engaging. So it's, it is physicians, as Julie says, but it's churches and mosques and synagogues, it's civic organizations, it's community-based organizations that I think are really important to have people to talk to them who they know, who are local and who are trusted.
Larry, we're just about out of time, so I want to.
Sorry.
Yeah, no.
The other problem is just.
I had hoped to ask everybody one last thing you might.
Okay,
want to
I'll
tell.
stop. Sorry.
No, but one word, 2-3 words. What would you tell the incoming public health leaders in the next administration? We all have concerns, but we're going to hope for the best and try to pass the torch well. One thing you would tell them. I'll let you start, Nikki, because we didn't get to you on this.
Yeah, sure. I guess what I would say is, number one, look at the global interdependencies and address the single points of failure. Prepare for the social consequences of what's going to happen. We haven't talked about that at all. And the trust about H5 isn't in a vacuum from trust about other stuff. If you're trusted, you can build trust now about all kinds of things, and it will serve you well in H5.
Okay, Rick, one thing, like 5 seconds.
No, I honestly, we believe pandemics are imminent, and what I think is really important is that we get the job done. So I think the new administration needs to establish a Manhattan Project or warp speed-like effort for pandemic preparedness that will focus on the speed and integration and countermeasures with significant sustained funding for next generation platform technologies, streamlined regulatory pathways, domestic manufacturing for capable and critical supplies, and integration of the animal health surveillance, very importantly. I think the highest priority would be leadership that recognizes pandemic preparedness as a national security priority and gets this done, not just as an initiative, but as something that's required for the new administration.
Okay, thank you. And Julie?
I would say something very mundane. Please sustain the Office of Preparedness in the White House for the coordinating function, because the government needs coordination for pandemic response and preparedness, and that office is serving a very important function, even though I know it's on the chopping block. So that would be my advice.
And Larry?
Well, mindful of the nomination of RFK Jr. as Secretary for HHS, I would just simply say trust in science, invest in science, and equitably deploy life-saving medical technologies.
Okay, great. Like, thanks so much to all of you. We could go on, probably should, for another half hour, but anyhow, for all the panelists today, our last panel, for the teams at O'Neill and GHI that have helped us put this on, great appreciation. And we'll digest this, all the input. There are a lot of questions panelists didn't get to. The recording will be posted, hopefully fairly soon. We're talking about putting together a brief 1 or 2 page summary of the meeting to share widely as well. And, you know, the potential for future meetings that bring people together. And certainly we would go out of our way also to engage the private sector. So thank you all very much. This is an important public health issue. I think we've helped focus attention on it generally and on specific things we need to do. So with that, I'll close this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.